Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you'll give the truth, nothing but nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Would you please state your full name for the record?
Theodore Robert Bundy.
Directing your attention to the early morning of August 15th, 1975, after you'd been stopped by Trooper Hayward, approximately what time of
Can
morning?
we establish that was really the 16th, or did we? That date,
Judge, there's a discrepancy in the report.
well, it's either the 15th or the 16th. Is there any question about that?
It's not
All right,
right.
as long as we're not hung.
The winter morning of January 4th, 1974, started like any other for 18-year-old Karen Sparks. The University of Washington student had no way of knowing that as she slept peacefully in her basement apartment near the campus, a shadow was already creeping through the darkness toward her door. The young woman, with her long brown hair and bright smile, represented everything pure and hopeful about college life in Seattle. But evil had already chosen her, and when the sun rose that morning, Karen's life would be forever changed by a man whose name would become synonymous with terror across America. Theodore Robert Bundy didn't look like a monster. Standing 6 feet tall with thick brown hair that he kept perfectly groomed, he possessed the kind of clean-cut, all-American appearance that mothers trusted and young women found attractive. His smile was disarming, his manner polite and educated. He spoke with the confidence of someone destined for success, carrying himself like the law student he claimed to be. But behind those dark eyes lurked something cold and calculating, a darkness that would eventually consume the lives of at least 30 young women and leave countless families shattered in its wake. The story of Theodore Robert Bundy began not with his birth, but with a secret that would shape his entire existence. On November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, Eleanor Louise Cowell gave birth to a boy she would name Theodore Robert Cowell. Louise, as she was known to friends and family, was only 22 years old and unmarried, a situation that brought tremendous shame to her deeply religious family in an era when unwed motherhood was considered a scandal that could destroy a family's reputation forever. The circumstances surrounding Ted's conception would remain a mystery that haunted him throughout his life. Eleanor never revealed who the father was, and as far as anyone knows, Ted never found out. Some family members whispered that Ted's grandfather might have been the father, though this was never proven. Others suggested it could have been a sailor Louise had met during her time away from home. The uncertainty of his paternity would become one of many shadows that followed Ted throughout his life, contributing to an identity crisis that may have played a role in his later transformation into a killer. For the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Roxborough neighborhood of Philadelphia with his maternal grandparents, Samuel Connect Cowell and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet. But this wasn't a normal grandparent relationship. The couple raised him as their son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied childbirth outside of marriage. In this elaborate deception, Louise was introduced to the world as Ted's older sister, not his mother. The lie was so convincing that Ted himself believed it for the first several years of his life. Samuel Cowell, Ted's grandfather, was a man whose violent tendencies and unstable behavior would leave lasting impressions on the young boy. Samuel was known to have explosive rages, during which he would throw objects and scream at family members. He was also rumored to have tortured animals and had an extensive collection of pornographic materials that he kept around the house. The toxic environment created by Samuel's presence meant that Ted was exposed to violence and dysfunction from his earliest days, experiences that may have warped his developing mind in ways that wouldn't become apparent until years later. Eleanor Cowell, Ted's grandmother, lived in constant fear of her husband's volatile moods. She suffered from severe depression and was reportedly so agoraphobic that she rarely left the house. The atmosphere in the Cowell home was one of tension, secrets, and barely contained violence. Young Ted learned early that survival meant adapting to chaos, reading the moods of unpredictable adults, and presenting whatever version of himself would keep him safe. These skills would later make him an expert manipulator, capable of becoming whatever his victims needed him to be. The elaborate family deception began to unravel when Ted was still a toddler. Louise, who had been working as a secretary while living with her parents, began to feel the weight of the lie that governed their lives. She wanted to be a real mother to her son, not just an older sister figure. The decision to leave Philadelphia and start fresh somewhere else must have been both terrifying and liberating for the young woman who had spent years living under the shadow of her family's shame. In 1950, when Ted was 4 years old, Louise made the brave decision to take her son and move across the country to Tacoma, Washington. The move represented a chance for both of them to start over, to create new identities away from the suffocating atmosphere of the Cowell household. For Louise, it meant finally having the opportunity to be Ted's mother openly, though she would still maintain the fiction about their relationship for several more years. For Ted, the move was the beginning of a new chapter, though the damage from his early years had already been done. Louise found work in Tacoma and tried to build a normal life for herself and her son. She was a kind, gentle woman who wanted nothing more than to provide Ted with the stable, loving home he had never known. But the secrets of their past continued to weigh on both of them. Ted was a bright, curious child, but he was also increasingly withdrawn and strange. Neighbors noticed that he seemed different from other children his age, too quiet, too observant, too adult in his mannerisms. The first signs that something was deeply wrong with Ted appeared when he was still very young. At age 3, he was found placing kitchen knives around his 15-year-old Aunt Julia while she napped, arranging them in a circle around her sleeping form. When Julia woke up to find herself surrounded by sharp blades and her young nephew standing nearby with a strange smile, she was terrified. This incident, which the family tried to dismiss as childhood curiosity, was actually an early indication of the darkness that was already growing inside Ted's mind. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a soft-spoken hospital cook who worked at the local veterans hospital. Johnny was everything Samuel Cowell had not been: kind, gentle, and stable. He treated Louise with respect and showed genuine affection for Ted, though the boy never seemed to return those feelings. When Louise and Johnny married, Ted took his stepfather's surname and became Theodore Robert Bundy, but he never formed a close bond with the man who tried so hard to be a good father to him. Johnny Bundy attempted to include Ted in family activities, teaching him to fish and camp, trying to show him the kind of healthy masculine role model he had never had. But Ted remained emotionally distant, preferring to spend time alone with his books and his increasingly dark thoughts. He was polite to Johnny, even calling him Dad, but there was no warmth in their relationship. Ted seemed incapable of forming genuine emotional connections, even with someone who showed him nothing but kindness. As Ted grew older, the family expanded with the addition of 4 more children: Linda, Glenn, Sandra, and Richard. Ted's younger siblings looked up to him as a big brother, but he remained emotionally detached from them as well. He would sometimes be helpful and protective, but other times he was cruel and manipulative, using his superior intelligence and size to control and intimidate them. The pattern of his relationships was already being established. Ted could be charming when it served his purposes, but he was incapable of genuine love or empathy. The revelation of Ted's true parentage came when he was a teenager, though exactly how he learned the truth varies depending on which account you believe. Some say he discovered his birth certificate while doing genealogy research for a school project. Others claim that a cousin revealed the family secret during an argument. Regardless of how he found out, the discovery that his sister was actually his mother and that his entire childhood had been built on a lie shattered whatever trust he might have had in the adults around him. Ted's reaction to learning the truth about his birth was typically controlled and calculating. Rather than expressing hurt or anger, he simply filed the information away and continued to present the same charming facade to the world. But privately, the revelation deepened his sense of alienation and resentment. He had always felt different from other people, and now he understood why. His very existence was a source of shame that had to be hidden and lied about. The teenage years were when Ted's personality truly began to crystallize into the shape it would maintain for the rest of his life. He was exceptionally intelligent, earning good grades without much effort and impressing teachers with his articulate speech and mature demeanor. But his intelligence was cold and calculating rather than warm and curious. He studied people the way a scientist might study laboratory specimens, learning to mimic emotions and social behaviors without actually feeling them. Ted's fascination with violence and control began to manifest more clearly during his high school years. He was caught shoplifting multiple times, though he was never prosecuted due to his clean-cut appearance and respectful manner when confronted by store security. He became obsessed with detective magazines and true crime stories, particularly those involving violence against women. His room was filled with images of injured and murdered women, though he was careful to hide this collection from his family. The pattern of Ted's relationships with women was established early. He was attracted to attractive, intelligent women, but he was incapable of maintaining genuine intimacy with any of them. Instead, he viewed relationships as games to be won, with women as prizes to be conquered and controlled. His early romantic relationships were characterized by manipulation and emotional abuse, though his victims often didn't recognize the abuse until years later. In 1965, Ted graduated from high school and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, though he showed little interest in his studies. He was more focused on perfecting his image and learning to manipulate the people around him. He became involved in student government and volunteer work, not out of any genuine desire to help others, but because these activities enhanced his reputation and gave him access to potential victims. It was during his college years that Ted met Stephanie Brooks, a young woman who would unknowingly become the template for many of his future victims. Stephanie was beautiful, intelligent, and came from a wealthy family. She had long, dark hair parted in the middle, and possessed the kind of sophisticated confidence that Ted found both attractive and threatening. Their relationship lasted about a year, during which Ted became increasingly obsessed with possessing and controlling her. Stephanie eventually broke up with Ted, telling him that he lacked direction and maturity. The rejection was devastating to Ted's ego, though he hid his hurt behind a mask of indifference. But privately, he began to plot his revenge against Stephanie and, by extension, all women who reminded him of her. The breakup marked a turning point in Ted's psychological development, transforming his latent hostility toward women into something much more dangerous. After the breakup with Stephanie, Ted's behavior became increasingly erratic and antisocial. He dropped out of college temporarily and drifted through a series of menial jobs, all while nursing his wounded pride and planning his comeback. He was determined to prove to Stephanie and everyone else that he was worthy of respect and admiration, but his definition of worth was twisted and ultimately destructive. In 1967, Ted met Elizabeth Klopfer at a bar in Seattle. Elizabeth, known to friends as Liz, was a divorced mother working as a secretary to support herself and her young daughter. She was immediately attracted to Ted's confidence and charm, seeing in him the stable, successful man she had always hoped to find. Their relationship would last for several years, during which Liz would unknowingly live with one of America's most dangerous serial killers. Ted was careful to present his best self to Liz, playing the role of the devoted boyfriend and surrogate father to her daughter. He was attentive and romantic, bringing flowers and gifts, taking them on trips and outings, and talking about their future together. But even during their happiest moments, there were signs that something was wrong. Ted's moods could shift without warning, and he sometimes displayed flashes of anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered them. Liz later recalled that Ted had unusual sexual appetites and could be rough and demanding in bed. He was also increasingly absent from their shared apartment, claiming to be studying at the library or working late at various jobs. In reality, he was beginning to stalk potential victims, learning their routines and planning his attacks with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else in his life. The transformation from wannabe killer to actual murderer was gradual and calculated. Ted spent months studying his intended victims, learning about their habits, their schedules, and their vulnerabilities. He practiced his approach in mirrors, perfecting the helpless, injured persona that would make young women want to help him. He modified his Volkswagen Beetle to make it easier to transport unconscious victims, removing the passenger seat and installing a hidden compartment in the back. Ted's first known attack occurred on that winter morning in January 1974. Karen Sparks was chosen not at random, but because she fit the profile that had been developing in Ted's mind for years. She was young, attractive, intelligent, and vulnerable, living alone in a basement apartment with minimal security. Ted had been watching her for weeks, learning her routine, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The attack on Karen was savage and personal. Ted didn't just want to kill, he wanted to dominate and control completely. The metal rod he used to beat her was taken from her own bed frame, a detail that showed his twisted sense of irony. He left her alive, though barely, perhaps because he was interrupted or because he hadn't yet worked up the courage to commit actual murder. But the attack gave him a taste of the power he craved, and it wouldn't be long before he escalated to killing. Karen's survival was nothing short of miraculous. She remained in a coma for months, and when she finally awakened, she had no memory of the attack. The brutal assault left her with permanent disabilities, but it also left investigators with crucial evidence about the type of person they were looking for. The methodical nature of the attack, combined with the sexual assault, indicated that they were dealing with an organized predator who would almost certainly strike again. The disappearance of Linda and Healy on February 1, 1974, marked Ted's first confirmed murder. Linda was everything Ted found irresistible in a woman: young, beautiful, intelligent, and independent. She was a psychology major at the University of Washington and worked as a radio announcer for ski reports. Her voice was familiar to thousands of listeners who tuned in each morning to hear the latest snow conditions in the Cascade Mountains. Ted had been stalking Linda for weeks, learning her schedule and noting the security weaknesses of the boarding house where she lived. On the night of February 1st, he entered her basement bedroom through an unlocked door, moving silently through the darkness. Linda was sleeping peacefully when Ted struck, using a piece of wood to render her unconscious before carrying her from the house. The crime scene in Linda's room told a story of meticulous planning and execution. Her bed was soaked with blood, but the sheets had been pulled up and tucked in neatly, as if someone had tried to hide the evidence. Her nightgown was hanging in the closet, and her clothes were missing, along with her backpack and books. To anyone who didn't look too closely, it might have appeared that Linda had simply gotten dressed and left for school. But the blood told a different story. The amount of blood found in Linda's room indicated that she had suffered a severe head injury, probably fatal. The careful staging of the scene showed that her attacker was organized and intelligent, someone who understood the importance of buying time before the victim was discovered missing. It was a level of sophistication that most first-time killers don't possess, suggesting that Ted had been planning and rehearsing his crimes for much longer than anyone realized. Linda's disappearance sent shockwaves through the University of Washington community. She was well-liked and responsible, not the type of person who would disappear without a word to anyone. When she failed to show up for her radio job, her employer immediately contacted the police. The discovery of the bloody bedroom confirmed everyone's worst fears. Linda had been the victim of a violent crime. The search for Linda Healy was massive and heartbreaking. Her family, friends, and dozens of volunteers combed the forests and mountains around Seattle, hoping against hope that she might still be alive. But Ted had been too careful, too thorough in his planning. Linda's body was eventually found on Taylor Mountain, along with the remains of several other victims, but not until Ted had killed many more women. The months following Linda's disappearance were marked by a series of vanishings that created a climate of fear unlike anything the Pacific Northwest had ever experienced. Ted Bundy would eventually confess to killing 30 women, most of them between the ages of 15 and 26. But the official count may represent only a fraction of his actual victims. Many experts believe he killed far more women than he ever admitted to, with some estimates reaching as high as 100 victims across multiple states. On March 12, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson became Ted's next confirmed victim. Donna was a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, known for her free-spirited nature and love of music and art. She was walking across campus to attend a jazz concert when she simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Her disappearance followed the same pattern as Linda's, a responsible young woman who wouldn't normally put herself in danger, gone without a trace. Donna's case was particularly heartbreaking because of her youth and the circumstances of her disappearance. She was just 19 years old, with her entire life ahead of her. She was studying to become a teacher and had dreams of traveling the world and making a difference in children's lives. Instead, she encountered Ted Bundy on a dark campus pathway, and those dreams died with her. The investigation into Donna's disappearance revealed just how carefully Ted had been planning his crimes. He had been observed on the Evergreen campus multiple times in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, always alone, always watching. He had learned the layout of the campus, identified the most isolated pathways, and chosen his victim carefully. Donna fit his preferred type perfectly: young, attractive, with long dark hair and entrusting nature. Susan Elaine Rancourt was next. The 18-year-old Central Washington University student disappeared on April 17, 1974, after leaving her dormitory to attend a movie. Her disappearance was completely out of character, and her friends and family knew immediately that something terrible had happened. Ted's approach to Susan followed his increasingly refined pattern. He had been watching her for weeks, learning her routine and identifying the perfect moment to strike. On the night she disappeared, Susan was walking across campus when Ted approached her, likely using his fake injury routine to gain her sympathy and trust. Once she was close enough, he struck with the same swift, brutal efficiency that had become his trademark. The disappearance of Susan Rancourt marked a turning point in the investigation. 3 young women had now vanished from college campuses in the Pacific Northwest, all fitting a similar physical description and all disappearing under similar circumstances. Police departments that had been treating each case as an isolated incident began to realize they might be dealing with a serial killer. Roberta Kathleen Parks, known to friends as Kathy, became Ted's next victim on May 6, 1974. The 22-year-old Oregon State University student was last seen leaving her dormitory for a walk around campus. Kathy was a quiet, studious young woman who was working toward a degree in religion. She was deeply religious and had planned to become a missionary after graduation. Her faith was an important part of her identity, and she lived her life according to strong moral principles that made her trust others and see the good in people. Ted likely saw Kathy's trusting nature as a weakness to be exploited. He approached her on the Oregon State campus using his well-practiced routine, pretending to be injured and in need of help. Kathy's natural compassion and desire to help others made her an easy target for Ted's manipulation. By the time she realized she was in danger, it was too late to escape. The disappearance of victims from multiple states was beginning to create a pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. The young women were all college students, all attractive and intelligent, all with long dark hair parted in the middle. They were disappearing from campuses in Washington, Oregon, and other western states, and the similarities between the cases were too obvious to be coincidental. Brenda Carol Ball was 22 years old when she became Ted's next victim on June 1, 1974. Unlike the previous victims, Brenda wasn't a college student. She worked as a cocktail waitress and was last seen leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, Washington, where she had been drinking with friends. Brenda had shoulder-length brown hair and a bright smile that made her popular with customers and co-workers alike. Ted's approach to Brenda was different from his campus attacks. At the tavern, he couldn't use his injured student routine, so he likely posed as a friendly stranger offering her a ride home. Brenda had been drinking and may not have been as cautious as she normally would have been. The alcohol may have impaired her judgment just enough to make Ted's offer seem reasonable. The expansion of Ted's hunting grounds to include bars and nightlife venues showed that he was becoming more confident and bold in his approach. He was no longer limiting himself to college campuses, which meant that virtually any young woman in the Pacific Northwest was potentially at risk. The realization sent fear through communities across the region. On June 11, 1974, 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins disappeared while walking the short distance between her boyfriend's fraternity house and her sorority at the University of Washington. Georgianne was a popular, outgoing young woman who was actively involved in campus life. She was studying speech pathology and had dreams of working with children who had communication disorders. Her disappearance was particularly shocking because it occurred on a well-lit street in a busy part of campus. Multiple witnesses saw Georgianne talking to a young man with his arm in a sling near the alley behind her sorority house. The man was asking for help carrying his briefcase to his car, claiming that his broken arm made it difficult for him to manage. Georgianne, always willing to help others, agreed to assist the seemingly injured stranger. She was never seen alive again. The witness descriptions of the man who approached Georgianne were remarkably consistent and detailed. He was described as attractive, well-dressed, and articulate, with dark hair and a clean-cut appearance. He drove a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle and spoke with what witnesses described as an educated accent. The composite sketch created from these descriptions would later prove to be remarkably accurate when Ted was finally arrested. The summer of 1974 brought Ted's most brazen and terrifying attacks yet. On July 14th, a beautiful Sunday afternoon at Lake Sammamish State Park, thousands of families and young people had gathered to enjoy the sunshine and escape the summer heat. The park was crowded with picnickers, swimmers, and sunbathers, creating the perfect hunting ground for a predator who had learned to hide in plain sight. Among the crowd were 23-year-old Janice and 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslund, two young women who would never return home from their day at the lake. Janice was a newlywed who had been married just 2 months earlier. She was a probation caseworker who dedicated her life to helping troubled youth find better paths. Denise was a computer programmer and part-time student who was known for her intelligence and quick wit. Multiple witnesses saw a handsome young man with his arm in a sling approaching women at the park throughout the day. He was friendly and charming, introducing himself as Ted and asking for help loading his sailboat onto his car. Most of the women he approached politely declined, but Janice was seen leaving with him around noon, walking toward the parking lot while carrying his sailing gear. The witnesses who saw Janice leave with Ted provided investigators with the most detailed description yet of the suspect. He was tall and attractive, with dark hair and a confident manner. He drove a metallic brown Volkswagen Beetle and wore casual clothes that made him blend in perfectly with the other young people at the park. Most importantly, he had introduced himself by name, giving investigators their first real clue about his identity. Denise Naslund disappeared from the same park later that afternoon. She had been picnicking with friends and family when she got up to use the restroom facilities. When she didn't return after a reasonable amount of time, her boyfriend went looking for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Like Janice, she had simply vanished. The Lake Sammamish abductions marked a turning point in both the investigation and Ted's criminal career. For the first time, multiple witnesses had seen him approach his victims, and several had heard him introduce himself by name. The police now had a name, Ted, and detailed descriptions of both the suspect and his car. More importantly, they knew they were dealing with someone who was becoming increasingly bold and reckless. The search for Janice and Denise was massive and heartbreaking. Hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement officers in combing the forests and mountains around Lake Sammamish, hoping to find some trace of the missing women. The media coverage was extensive, with newspapers and television stations providing daily updates on the search efforts. The disappearances at Lake Sammamish created a level of fear in the Pacific Northwest that was unlike anything the region had experienced before. Parents kept their daughters close to home, women traveled in groups, and everyone looked suspiciously at clean-cut young men who seemed a little too friendly or helpful. The idea that a serial killer was stalking young women had moved from theory to terrifying reality. Meanwhile, Ted Bundy continued his normal life with chilling composure. He attended his classes at the University of Washington, worked his various part-time jobs, and maintained his relationship with Liz. He even participated in the search for some of his own victims, joining volunteer groups that combed the forests looking for missing women. The audacity of inserting himself into the investigations showed just how confident he had become in his ability to deceive and manipulate everyone around him. In the fall of 1974, Ted made a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He moved to Salt Lake City to attend the University of Utah College of Law. The move was motivated partly by his desire to advance his education and career, but also by his need to escape the increasingly intense investigation in the Pacific Northwest. He may have also believed that a change of scenery would help him control his violent impulses, though events would prove that his compulsions were stronger than his willpower. Ted's arrival in Utah coincided with a new wave of disappearances and murders that followed the same pattern established in Washington and Oregon. Throughout the 1970s, Bundy traveled across the United States on a rape and murder spree of young women and girls, with known victims from Washington, Utah, Oregon, Idaho, Colorado, and Florida. The consistency of his methods and victim selection across multiple states would eventually help investigators connect the crimes and identify him as the perpetrator. On October 2, 1974, just weeks after Ted's arrival in Utah, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared from Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Nancy was a high school student who was known for her kindness and maturity beyond her years. She was walking home from an evening school function when she vanished, becoming Ted's first known victim in Utah. Nancy's disappearance was particularly tragic because of her age and the circumstances of her life. At just 16, she was one of Ted's youngest victims, and her death represented a new low in his criminal career. She had been an honors student with plans to attend college and become a teacher. Her family was devastated by her disappearance, and the case received extensive media coverage throughout Utah. The investigation into Nancy's disappearance revealed that Ted had been stalking potential victims in the Salt Lake City area for weeks before he finally struck. He had been seen on high school campuses and in areas where teenagers congregated, always watching, always planning. His careful observation of potential victims showed that his methods were becoming even more refined and calculated. On October 18, 1974, 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith disappeared from Midvale, Utah. Melissa was the daughter of Lewis Smith, the police chief of Midvale, which added an extra layer of irony and horror to her disappearance. She was a popular high school student who worked part-time at a pizza restaurant. On the night she disappeared, she had been at a slumber party with friends and was walking to a convenience store when she vanished. The fact that Ted had targeted the daughter of a police chief showed either incredible boldness or a complete lack of concern for the consequences of his actions. It may have been a conscious decision to taunt law enforcement, or simply a coincidence that Melissa happened to fit his preferred victim profile. Regardless of his motivation, the crime sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community in Utah. Melissa's body was found 9 days after her disappearance in a wooded area near Park City. The condition of her remains revealed the same pattern of sexual assault and murder that characterized all of Ted's crimes. The medical examiner determined that she had been killed shortly after her abduction, meaning that Ted had held her captive for only a brief time before ending her life. The discovery of Melissa's body provided investigators with crucial evidence about the killer's methods and psychology. The location where her body was found was remote and carefully chosen, indicating that the perpetrator was familiar with the local geography and had scouted disposal sites in advance. The condition of the remains suggested that the killer derived sexual satisfaction from violence and death, marking him as an extremely dangerous predator. November 8, 1974, brought one of the most significant developments in the Ted Bundy case, the attempted abduction of 18-year-old Carol Duranch. Carol's escape from Ted's clutches would provide investigators with their first living witness and crucial evidence that would eventually help convict him. Carol was shopping at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, when she was approached by a man claiming to be Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. The man was clean-cut and well-dressed, with the kind of authoritative manner that made his story believable. He told Carol that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to come with him to the police station to file a report and view a suspect. Something about the man made Carol uneasy from the beginning, but his official story and confident manner convinced her to cooperate. She walked with him to the parking lot, where he showed her a car that he claimed was hers but which she knew wasn't. When she pointed out the mistake, he suggested that perhaps the attempted break-in had been unsuccessful and asked her to come with him to the police station anyway. Carol's decision to get into the man's Volkswagen Beetle nearly cost her life. As soon as they drove away from the mall, the man's demeanor changed completely. The polite, professional officer persona disappeared, replaced by something cold and menacing. He drove erratically and seemed agitated, muttering to himself and ignoring Carol's questions about where they were going. When the man stopped the car in a dark residential area, Carol realized she was in mortal danger. He tried to handcuff her, but she fought back with desperate strength, managing to grab the door handle and partially escape from the car. The man tried to strike her with a crowbar, but Carol was able to dodge the blow and run into the street, where she flagged down a passing motorist who helped her escape. Carol's description of her attacker was detailed and accurate. She described him as handsome and well-dressed, with dark hair and a mustache. She noted that he drove a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle and that he had handcuffs and a crowbar in his car. Most importantly, she was able to provide investigators with the first real physical evidence in the case, a handcuff key that the attacker had dropped in his struggle to restrain her. The attempted abduction of Carol Duranch was significant not just because she survived, but because it showed that Ted was becoming bolder and more reckless in his approach. The use of a fake police officer persona was a new tactic that showed his increasing sophistication as a predator. It also revealed his willingness to take enormous risks, approaching a victim in a crowded public place during the day. Just hours after Carol Duranch's escape, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared from Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah. Deborah had been attending a school play with her parents when she left the auditorium during intermission to pick up her brother from a nearby ice arena. She never returned to the play, and her brother was later found waiting at the arranged pickup location. The timing of Deborah's disappearance, just hours after the failed abduction of Carol Duranch, suggested that Ted had been hunting in the same general area throughout the evening. Unable to successfully abduct Carol, he had apparently continued searching for another victim, ultimately targeting Deborah as she left the high school alone. A handcuff key found in the parking lot of Viewmont High School was later determined to match the handcuffs that Ted had attempted to use on Carol Duranch. This physical evidence provided the first concrete link between the attempted abduction and Deborah's disappearance, confirming that the same person was responsible for both crimes. The investigation into these Utah crimes revealed that Ted was becoming increasingly systematic and organized in his approach. He was scouting locations in advance, preparing his equipment, and developing detailed plans for each attack. The fake police officer routine was just one of several personas he had developed to gain his victims' trust. The murders continued throughout 1975 as Ted expanded his hunting grounds to include Colorado and Idaho. In January 1975, he killed Karen Eileen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who was vacationing with her fiancé at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass, Colorado. Karen was an intensive care nurse who had dedicated her career to saving lives, making her murder particularly tragic and ironic. Ted's approach to Karen followed a pattern that was becoming familiar to investigators. He had been staying at the same hotel, observing.